I've prepared some really clever questions for the panelists, but I think I would like to turn it around. And after, please sit down. And after you heard these impressive presentations, I would like to start with questions that you might have and then revert to my questions. So anybody, please. So please introduce yourself.
My name is Jean-Patrick Gromberg. I'm a journalist, Israeli journalist from French origin. I have a question for Moran and for the other panelists. By the way, I loved the speech. It was very interesting. You said that in the beginning, you said that your kids coming back from school and reading, learning stories from the Bible, that it's the same story all over again. And my question is this. With all the disinformation that we read about the conflict and the war zone today, is it possible that, not in the Bible, but in history books, is it possible that the same disinformation was transmitted in the history books that we all learned and accepted as fact, since the people who were reporting about the war were people from were close to the leaders and might have been tempted to please the leaders, or afraid to be killed or something like that. So my question is this: is it possible that a lot or some of the history we know today is wrong?
What a loaded question, please.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not a historian, it's important to note. But if I need to guess an educated guess, I would say... yeah, of course. I thought I was loud enough. If I would have to make an educated guess, I would assume that like any other information we're receiving from any source, even the Bible, it was framed in a specific way. It's presented to us in a specific way, while emphasizing some elements, while hiding altogether other elements. And I would assume that they wrote history, or the people that wrote history wrote it in a way that emphasized some elements while hiding others. Now, we know that fake news is not a new phenomenon. We like to use it as a new phenomenon. And today a lot, when we're talking about conflicts, we're talking about information operations or media operations, and about trying to influence and make people perceive reality in a certain way. That's definitely not a new phenomenon. And again, it goes back to biblical day. And as an atheist, I spoke a lot about the Bible today. But I do believe that reality is being framed for us and presented to us in a certain way that works for somebody's benefit.
Anybody else from the panel?
Other people that want to talk about the Bible?
I can add to this. I can add to this that when we teach our students, all newspapers, television stations are all biased, one way or another. And we teach our students, if you really want to get a true picture of a situation, you have to follow multiple sources. At the time of the Bible, it was somewhat available, but today we have to teach people how to consume media, and the first lesson is distrust what you hear, put a question mark, and try to get information from as many sources as you can. Professor Weiman.
Thank you. My question can be entitled by short title, Embedding in the Age of New Media, or Future Embedding. Let me explain 4 assumptions before I present my question. First is that, as you said, Moran and Noam, the war is over mind and hearts, and is conducted more on the battleground of the media than in the actual battleground. That's the first assumption. Second, states and actors, non-state actors, know it. It's not just in the academia that we know it. And As a result, actors and states invest more in trying to influence and sometimes manipulate the media. And the fourth assumption is that embedding is one of the most popular and recent tools of trying to influence media coverage. Now, these are the four assumptions. This was true until today, but now we're discussing new media, a new media environment, when it is getting very tough to embed journalists, because you have non-conventional, non-institutional media sources. So how can you do, and this is I think an interesting academic question to both of you, the academics in the panel, what will be the future of embedding in the new media environment? I can propose at least three directions which may be true or false. I would like to have your estimation. One is fake journalists. When the embedding will be done in the social media using somebody who pretends to be an innocent journalist or innocent surfer or innocent user of the media. So we will have more fake journalism in social media. Second, we will have more fake news. Items fed to the media by interested actors. That can be states, but can be also terrorist organizations. And the third one, very relevant to your work, Noam, is harnessing new technology to harness the new media. For example, states and non-state actors using non-human journalists, non-human people who post online, can be robots, can be bots, can be botnets, and so on. So basically, this is a question.
I want to extend this question. It's one of the questions I prepared. In light of my presentation, how the three of you, the journalists, how do you view your future work in light of all these new technologies that Professor Weimann is mentioning, and I mentioned all the drones and robots and chatbots and eyes in the sky? How do you view your work in light of these new technologies? Would it reduce the risk of actually being there? I hope that this is the question to the three of you.
I mean, it's fascinating to think about all the possibilities that there are ahead in terms of ways we can integrate drones, AI, etc. into our coverage. And for me, it's really exciting. You know, it is also scary. It's hard to know where it's going to take the industry. My own feeling is in terms of the kind of war reporting that we've been talking about, I think we're less likely to be replaced immediately by robots, and a much, much bigger danger is just budgets. I think as we've all talked about in different ways, it's an incredibly expensive thing to do. You can rack up thousands and thousands of dollars in expenses very, very quickly in these war zones. And it isn't profitable, you know, for most of our media organizations. That said, my experience in Israel is that Israelis are some of the most avid news consumers anywhere in the world and really are interested in serious stuff. But in the UK and the US, it's not at all clear to me that sending somebody to a war zone for several weeks is actually going to make money back for the media organization. A lot of the time, it's something that organizations do for prestige. They feel that they have a certain public duty to do it. So my concern is that we are going to lose the financial will to do this kind of reporting long before we get to a point where robots or technology is going to replace what we've been doing on the ground.
Fluff?
Okay, so I agree. I actually think that maybe this is going to be the last form of journalism, like old-fashioned journalism, because I think like Seth spoke about being the first one in the field documenting history while it's happening. And that no one can replace that. It's not something that you can have anyone do except for you. So getting to all those remote places, other people are not getting there. I think that's the real journalism, and they trust you to go and get this information. And that's something you can't get online, and you can't get in social medias, and you can't get on Twitter. You have to be on the ground. So I'm actually not worried about that. And about embedding, I think I related to so much of the things you said, because I think we've been in the same place at the same time, we just never met. Like Bashika and embedding, and I even saw pictures of people I interviewed there. And I think that you talked about embedding and how it what's the impact on us. Well, I had the same thoughts when I saw all this, the Peshmerga who had so much motivation, but when I interviewed them, one had 10 children and one was 15-year-old, and the women are really not, like you said, it's not in Syria, it is, but then in Iraq. And so I don't think that we are blinded by it. It's true that when you're in bed, you get the clear message that if you say the wrong things, you might have a problem next time, but it doesn't stop you from doing your job. And I think showing I don't know, well, I also work in Israeli TV, so I don't know how much they follow my reports afterwards, so maybe I'm privileged in that way. But showing that they have problems in the front, showing that they're not a professional army, showing that they have their own problems, I think it's also, that's the truth, and I don't think the truth is bad for them either. Maybe it will help them get more help. I talked about them using weapons they got from the US without knowing how to use it. At one point in the Bashika battle, they opened a trunk with all these bombs and they had no idea what to do with it. It was all American and they really didn't know how to use it. And I said so in my report. So I think that it might be tricky, but I don't feel it. I think in the end, the line is pretty clear.
Seth?
Yeah, you raised a bunch of important different questions. I don't think I can answer all of them, but I thought I'd just give 2 extra points maybe here. Like, one of the things is, I don't know if it's not exactly fair to characterize maybe whether you're embedded or not embedded. I think there's a hybrid embedded nature of some journalists. So, you're on the front line. Sometimes you're with a unit, and sometimes you grab a taxi and you go to another unit, or you just leave or talk to civilians that are nearby. I mean, you're not always being wrangled and forced to be with them. And I think one issue that this also raises, as you said, is, well, what happens, because of all this new media, what happens, when obviously you're collecting information from people that are on the front line, they're forwarding you videos. Someone forwarded me a picture from this airstrike that took place in Abu Kamal a few days ago. And, said, oh, this, my friend from the Shia militia sent me this. Okay, I don't know, is it real, is it not? Is it I need to give it to someone to see if they can triangulate where it was actually took place. Who knows? We don't know. So we have so much information. There was a bombing yesterday in Iraq of this island where the coalition dropped 35,000 kilograms of bombs on an island. There were 2 videos of the bombing. One was by a coalition drone. The other one's on the ground, taken by the Iraqi security forces guys, their media team. And then the American military spliced those together. I got both the videos before they'd been spliced together. The Americans put this nice stuff together. But okay, so we have that. As a journalist, would it have benefited me to be with the ISAF Iraqi guys, or I can't be in the drone, I guess, so I could be in the American war room with watching the drone as they watch it? How much more added value would I bring as a journalist? I don't know. There's obviously a story to be told about that incident. Can I go to the island afterward? But I have to go with the Iraqi guys anyway, so I'm embedded in a sense. How can I collect information by myself? I probably can't. This is a highly secure environment. So it leads to all these dilemmas, I think, that's right. And we have to ask ourselves, okay, what happens when the coalition lies, or when the Iraqis lie about what they did? Of course, we as journalists, our duty to somehow try to filter some of that. Like that picture I got from Abu Kamal, which I think is total nonsense. But, I mean, of course, as a journalist, I could just tweet that out. I can pretend I got it. But okay, so there's all these types of dilemmas, but I think we need to understand that too. It's not always black and white. It's not always like being embedded or not. There is sometimes a hybrid, complex nature, and as a journalist, you may gather a bunch of information from your fixers, or people give you pictures or something, as well as information you gathered. And of course, it's your job or someone's job to try to filter that. And hopefully, if you're doing a decent job, you're trying your best to do that and not put out, for instance, fake or misleading news.
Questions? Please.
Dr. Fransman mentioned during his speech the being asked by his editors to go find a Yazidi woman who was a captive and then became a sniper and all that. And certainly a lot of the stories that I remember reading about the Kurdish fighters and the people fighting against the regimes are that kind of story. It's I don't want to call it a fluff piece, but it's a fluff piece about, there's a really nice story and it's heartwarming and it's very cool and all that. Is there a benefit to those stories in terms of at least getting people's eyes on the conflicts, even if they're not on the conflict itself, but they're at least learning something about what's going on? Or should we be trying to focus on what's actually going on the ground, what the facts of the battles, the facts of the matter at hand, even at the risk of losing clicks, losing eyes on the story, losing eyes on the conflict as a whole?
Anybody? Right.
Well, I just did a story about the women revolution in Syria, and I was faced with that dilemma because, okay, this is on record, so, but you have to understand that when you come back, you try to explain where you've been, and people who send you there sometimes don't really understand where it is. It's hard to understand. I mean, there are a few who do know, but sometimes people say, so you're in Iraq, Syria, Turkey, where exactly? What, you really went into Syria? I'm like, yeah, Raqqa. What, it's in the middle of Syria? Yeah. And then they say, okay, so there's a woman revolution. So the Yazidi became fighters of the YPJ. And you say, no, they are the YPJ, and they're Kurdish mostly, and it's one type of women, and they're the Yazidi minority, and they did join the army. Even though it can be a really nice thesis, right, to show how it, but you don't do that. So I had to think how I can tell the story and show both stories at the same time, but without anyone thinking that it's the same women that were raped and now became soldiers, because that's not the truth. So what I did was I interviewed those soldiers who liberated the Yazidi women about liberating them. And they said the most amazing things, because they said, we are here to liberate all women in the Middle East, and it doesn't matter if they're Kurdish or Yazidi or Syrian, Sunni or whatever. So I could tell the whole story, and I had to go into specific, and it was possible, but it does mean you have to do the extra work, and you have to tell your editor, I'm sorry, but it's not going to be fluffy like you said. It's not Hollywood. This is the truth, and let's think how we can tell it in the most interesting way.
Okay.
I think it's always good.
I was just going to say,
Sorry.
in terms of that eternal dilemma in media in anything, it's sort of a reflection of human nature, right? One death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. Is there value to zeroing in on one specific colorful story that gets people's attention? I think so, as long as it, as Efrat said, as long as it gets their attention and you hold it, and then you can zoom out and talk about bigger issues. The human mind, clearly, we're just designed that we respond to individual stories. If you give us the stories of a million people in one go, we get saturated, we tune out, and I don't think that benefits anybody.
Go on.
So we need to think about newsworthiness. And definitely when you take, we call it the pornography of media coverage of conflict. When you take a story that has certain elements, it would definitely get more media coverage. But it relates to what Professor Weiman asked before about the future of embedded journalism. I think that today we're lucky that professional journalists are out there, because we just heard from Efrat what was her solution to this situation, and when it's a professional journalist, I know I can trust their values to some extent, that they would do it in a proper way that will defend their sources, that they would try to make sure that it's not fake news in some way. I wouldn't call it fake journalist, Gabi, because I think that a YouTuber today or a person with 10,000 followers on Instagram that probably catches the eye of audiences we never will also has an impact. So
I didn't mean to call them.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
I spoke about actors, states, organizations
that will put like people.
Yeah.
Okay. That's a different situation. As long as it's authentic testimonies, I think it would have some value. But in today's reality, and where we talked about deepfake a little bit earlier, I think it's a huge issue, and we would need to find a way to counter it, because it's really troubling.
First of all, it's a pleasure to have you with us. My name is Ibrahim Ahmad. I'm a senior researcher in the Alma Center in the north of Israel. We focus on Israel's security challenges on the northern borders. And I guess my personal question is the issue of, some of that journalism, I guess, makes my work a bit harder sometimes, especially in the case of, I don't want to talk about fake news, but talk about black and white kind of image in the news. And people that come in, let's say for instance in Israel, they have the perception it's a very black and white image of what's going on here. Particularly as somebody who's from the Arab minority in Israel, you're always faced with the question of a very black and white kind of an image of the situation here. But the problem in the way we see it is that the media always focuses on the black side, not even the white, but only the black of the other side. It's always what is wrong with the other perception that is against mine. And we have an example of kind of a project that was done in the north about like a Christmas run for 5,000 people, and nobody really wanted to put it in the media in Israel, even though we had people from all the different sects, Muslim, Christians, Jews. So my question is, how do we make the positive image in media and the one that sheds lights on complexity rather than a very black and white image more appealing or sexy in terms of being there on the top news, showing a real complex matter rather than a black and white one. Mr. Raf, you mentioned the issue of Shamima. I think it's an excellent example because what she said in the interview to the BBC was very enlightening. That she doesn't regret going. She regrets the outcome, but she definitely doesn't regret going. So for me, her perception as a Muslim in Britain, she didn't feel like very much British. So when you talk about the media and showing Islam in a very one-sided image in Britain, that definitely will have an impact on Muslim citizens, and will definitely infuse the fact that they don't see themselves as British. How do we make that make a more of understanding of the complexity of the certain religion or a sect that is different than us and not just very black and white? I guess the question is for everyone.
I just want to enlarge your question. It brings in the big elephant, which is not here in the room. It's in the room, but we're not talking about it. Is the editors and the media companies. You, as journalists in the area, can transmit beautiful, complex stories, but the media, the managers, the editors, they would tend to go to the black and white stuff. Less complexity, they want rating. How do you deal with this question, and how do you deal with your editors in this kind of situations? Efrat, you are the first.
Thank you. You don't give me time to think about the diplomatic answer.
No. Here we are closed session. It's
I don't know. I see the
it's a
camera
closed
over
session.
there.
Don't be politically correct with me, I beg you.
And 6 days to the elections. Nobody
Yeah.
cares what's first.
Not as much as politically correct.
Well, first of all, about positive stories, I gotta tell you. So I do work corresponding, but I'm also working on a program on Friday night, and each night, you hear me, right? They hear me. You don't hear me? That's good.
I don't hear
And every night I have a different story.
Don't hear you.
And Friday night we have a different story. No, that's fine with me. So I actually feel like they are telling us do more positive stuff. Now the cameraman hates me. Okay. Yeah. We don't do that to fellows, right?
While you take the mic, I would say that in a recent study about newsworthiness, they actually found that positive news are also a newsworthiness element these days.
It is because it seems like, we believe that on Friday night we have viewers from all ages, because people watch TV with their kids. And it was interesting because I was sitting in the studio before they broadcasted my story from Syria, and I got text messages from friends saying, should we get our kids out of the room, away from the screen? And it was really interesting, and I said, yeah, why would you like a 5-year-old to see what ISIS did? But I guess my editors wouldn't want people to switch a channel because the child is sitting next to them. So I think that there is more, we're looking for positive stuff, more, that's what I feel. Less black and white, or even black and white, but more positive, happy stories. Even if you do, I did a few weeks ago a story about 4 children who are waiting for a heart transplant, and it was very, very sad, and I said, okay, who wants to sit and see a story about 4 children who are about to die if they won't get a heart? And then we found like the happy story. There was one kid and he was Arab. His name was Adam, and he got a heart from a kid whose parents are from a settlement, religious, Jewish, Orthodox. And we did a meeting between those two families, and that was like a happy end to the story. So there are still 3 kids who are waiting, and one had to go abroad in a very dangerous procedure to get a heart. But there was like a closure for the people to watch it on Friday night and say, oh, okay, there is a relief. So I think maybe we're actually moving forward a better thing with this. And sorry about taking the discussion away from war corresponding.
Seth, you want to answer that? Or Raf?
Well, just to answer some of the things you raised directly. In terms of our coverage of Muslims in Britain, we have a very, very long way to go. And I think those of us in the media really need to, look in the mirror and hold ourselves accountable. And I'm happy, away from the camera, I'm happy to continue that conversation with you. But that's one thing. As has been said, it's actually amazing the extent to which editors, the people who in theory, the problem here are finding that positive news is getting the clicks, and you're seeing media organizations all over the place, verticals now that are dedicated only to positive news. It's uplifting stories about dogs that come home and children who get perfect, exam results. And I think that's fine, and clearly people like it, and there's so much misery in the world that we could do with a bit of that. But I also think, there's a reason that we focus on the bad news, because the people who are responsible for the bad news are not going to tell that story themselves, whereas the people who organize the nice runs at Christmas time are going to tell those stories. They are going to get them out. There's a joke in the media about there's a reason we cover the buses that crash, but not the buses that get to their destinations every day, right? It is our job to focus on the things that need improving, to bring them to society's attention. And that can feel sometimes like a relentless focus on bad news, but from where we're sitting, it often feels like holding the powerful accountable and pointing to the things that need improving.
I think the question was a bit different. It was about the complexity, not positive or negative, but the tendency of the editors to show rating. They equate rating to black and white. I don't think they equate rating to complexity, because they say our audiences are stupid and they cannot understand complex issue. I think this was your question.
Yeah, it's like, thanks for narrowing it down.
And which you avoided. I think...
I noticed, but I didn't want to say anything. I was going to ask later on without the camera behind me.
But just on that subject, again, we're actually finding that some of the content that is doing incredibly well is really long-form, complicated, subtle things. Podcasts are just an absolutely enormous industry, and if you'd asked people a few years ago, do listeners want to sit for an hour and a half and listen to complex, everyone would say, no, you've got to do it in 30 seconds, it's got to be tweetable. Podcasts are enormous, they're super profitable, and we're finding also long-form documentary stuff is doing much, much better than 600-word news stories. So I'd say in some ways, I agree with you, clearly things get flattened out in media stories, but if complexity is what you're after, the trend lines, I think, are positive in that direction.
And last question.
Can I just ask Well, I just say that, there seems to be sometimes a fundamental misunderstanding, and I don't mean by yourself or necessarily by the editor, but just in general, of the whole nature of the fact that this new media allows us to have this complexity, so that the clickbait story about the sniper who killed someone from 3,000 meters or something crazy can actually lead the reader into the long-form piece, and from the long-form piece into the podcast. I mean, I saw, for instance, there was a piece of The Atlantic where they had a long-form piece, and then they had, you could listen to it also about this, that the Malaysian airline that had disappeared. They had this huge piece. It was great. So first of all, you could also listen to it, or you could read it. And I assume with that, you could also have the small clickbait story about it as well. I mean, I think that the nice thing about the clickbait, it's not all bad. It drives the viewer to the site. It drives the viewer somewhere. I think as a media, one of the challenges is trying to find a way to then not put more clickbait in front of the reader, which is sometimes the problem, but try to draw them into the more complex story. And I think that, so it doesn't have to be an either or. Like, I think as a writer, that's the problem, is that editor that told me, yeah, but why don't you find the sniper, blah, blah, blah. What if the editor had said, listen, why don't you write a 300-word story about that sniper with pictures and make it sexy? Okay, fine, I don't mind to sacrifice my time doing that. And also, why don't you put together a 5,000 word or 2,000 word long form piece about this? That would be a great solution. Everybody wins. The person that has 2 minutes to read the story wins. Maybe the person that wants the visual wins. And maybe the person that wants to sit down for 2 hours and read also wins. And we have an internet. It's not 1950. We have an endless black hole of information out there. Why not? We can do better in terms of, I think, using that sometimes.
Okay, you've been such a nice audience, so I'm trying to cut short. 2 more questions, and you're first, please.
Thanks. I realize you all work as, correspondents.
Sorry, your name, please?
Terrorism. My name is Paris. I'm in New York. I work contracted with the Middle East Forum. As a consumer of news and someone who stands on the verge of being a journalist, but also monitoring journalism, I'm really concerned with what I see as really daily in mainstream news sources, not as much in Israel, but everything from BBC to NPR to New York Times, a willingness to not report on organizations, mainstream organizations, whether they are nonprofit groups, civil rights groups, mosques in the case of jihadism, that have ties, links to terrorist groups, financial ties, material ties, or even just have a history of verbal support. And these groups they go on broadcast news networks, representatives from these groups, and they are interviewed as if they are unbiased experts, and their ties to designated terrorist organizations are not reported. And I see that happening on a daily basis, and I'm wondering, is there any talk about that, about the lack of reporting on groups or individuals that are tied to terrorist organizations in the journalist community?
Who wants to start? Moran?
I'm not familiar with that.
Well,
Sir.
I guess I can say that, I don't know the full details of everything, but I guess what is important, I think, when we do interview someone, or I don't do TV, but I think I write. When you interview someone, obviously everyone has agendas. So in some cases, you do obviously what you do an example of is someone that is portraying themselves as some random, normal, moderate spokesman on behalf of something, but actually secretly his or her organization is funded by so-and-so, and it's actually funded by some extremist group, or even funded by a government, maybe a foreign government that has an agenda. So I think, of course, it is important, I think, as the person doing the interview or something, to also vet that source a bit and get a sense of, what is actually behind that sometimes. And if, there is, of course, that struggle, I guess, in a newsroom, is how do you label some of these people? I mean, because maybe you've quoted this person, and maybe the newsroom says, well, let's label this person far right, or we'll label that person far left. Or, by the way, this whole case of the terrorist thing with the Olympic attack, where the AP got attacked because they labeled them guerrillas, right? And then the AP actually took down the image and said, oh, we didn't need to, actually, we shouldn't have said guerrillas, because perhaps guerrillas is in fact the wrong term, and they did murder athletes. So I think that's a thing you face all the time, and I think it is true that because of the declining budgets, it is true that we are sometimes, I think, preyed upon a bit by organizations or countries that have a big budget that are able to put people in front of you to respond to stories or press releases or whatever. So because you have a limited amount of time and resources, you go to this person X all the time for response quotes, and that person is perhaps not sometimes fully identified as to what their other role is or who pays them and things, and that's a huge problem. And I think every newsroom wrestles with how to do that, and whether if we identify them, for instance, as far right or something, is that fair? Is that a wrong way to identify them? Or, so I think it's a big challenge, and it's a whole nother. It's not, and we talk about conflict journalism, so that's one thing we do. So that's different on some of that stuff. This is a challenge across the news business, I suppose. Is that guy who talked to, who's giving you some story about tobacco actually a spokesman for what do they call it, the e-cigarettes or whatever? And actually he's telling you tobacco's bad, but no, secretly it's for e-cigarettes. I mean, who knows? And I think that's important.
Last question, please.
Yes, my name is Nathalie Benoit. I'm a counsel with the Canadian government. So thank you, first of all, for your very interesting presentation. coming from Canada, I've learned a lot in this conference today. My question will be short. I just want to know teenagers, how to get them out of just looking at Instagram and actually getting interested in what you've talked about today. Any advice?
I'll start with Moran. She's also a mother in academia.
Yeah, no, it's a challenge. Actually, studies found that political interest is something that starts at a pretty young age. I already told you that I have 2 boys at home, and I think like most Israelis, they're pretty politically active or at least interested in politics. I don't think you can make people be interested in politics, but I think that exposing them to information from a relatively young age, of course, according to the age, is a good way of doing that. I think that making is a difficult word, but if the people that they are actually following on YouTube, Instagram, or whatever would be interesting and talking about politics in an interesting way, they would start being more interested in that field. We do see it in various on various issues. When celebrities express their opinions, you see that other people are more likely to do that as well. We had a lot of examples in Israel in the last few years regarding that. And how to get them away from screens, that's a totally different issue.
This doesn't help you in terms of getting them away from screens, but in terms of getting them interested in the news, a big part of it is just going where they are, right? So at the Telegraph, we have a Snapchat channel, and I'm 31, and I didn't really know what Snapchat was or how to use it, but I look at it now, and it's actually a great medium. It's beautiful. You can tell stories in interesting ways, and I think it's really valuable. We tell complicated, important stories, but we do it on Snapchat, and I don't see any problem with that. In the same way that people would be like, oh no, like TV is a very facile medium, back in the day. It doesn't always have to be words on page. So.
He's 31, but he's old. Okay, I think just a few words. I want to thank very much our journalist and Juan for very impressive talks. I think we touched a lot of the dilemmas quite seriously. I want to ask you to make sure that next time you go to Warzone, to make sure you come back with your head on. I think I would propose the conference people that next year, in addition to journalists, you have your editors, because editors have 2 important jobs. One is to decide what to put on, and secondly, for how long to show it. And we know that, I think I started in my introduction, when there is a terror incident, the purpose of the terror is to get attention of the public. And at least the Israeli media stop everything else for hours and hours. They show on loops exactly what the terrorists want them to show. And I think it's irresponsible. I heard some of you, I think it was Raf, saying we are going to have some guidelines about how to deal with terror and make sure that what we report does not have terror. But I think this issue of how the media in general handles terror incidents, I think it's a very open issue, very problematic. And I think next year we should have journalists and editors together, and not from the same media. So thank you very much for coming. And we are free from